In 1980, a Chevrolet dealership manager in a small Sunbelt town did something that made absolutely no sense. He took a brand new Camaro, one that had never been sold, never been driven more than a few miles, and he had it rolled into a private storage building behind the dealership. Then he locked the door, and he told his own staff never to open it again. For 45 years, nobody did. Not his employees, not his family, not the people who bought the dealership after he was gone. The building just sat there, quietly at the edge of a gravel lot, while decades passed outside its walls. Cars changed, gas prices changed, the entire automotive world changed. And that Camaro just sat in the dark, untouched, like time had simply forgotten it existed. Stay with me here, because the reason this car was buried is stranger than anything you have heard about a barn find before, and by the end of this video, you are going to understand why even the people who eventually found it still are not sure they believe what they uncovered. Before we get into what was actually found behind that locked door, you need to understand something about the Camaro itself, because this is not just about one car. This is about a machine that Chevrolet built to answer a threat, and almost lost control of. In the middle of the 1960s, Ford had a problem for General Motors. The Mustang had exploded onto the scene, and it was selling in numbers nobody predicted, pulling in young buyers who wanted something fast, affordable, and different from their parents' sedans. General Motors did not have an answer. Not yet. So engineers inside Chevrolet were handed a mandate that came from the very top of the company, and the mandate was simple. Build something that beats the Mustang and do it fast. What came out of that pressure was the Camaro, a car built in a hurry, under intense internal competition, with teams inside General Motors fighting each other over which version of the design would actually reach production. Some of those internal battles were so fierce that entire prototype lines were scrapped overnight, their designers reassigned without explanation. The Camaro that rolled off the line was not just a car. It was the product of corporate panic, ego and ambition, all compressed into one machine. And that tension never really left the car. It followed certain Camaros for decades, and as you're about to see, it followed this one straight into that locked storage building. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because the man who ordered that Camaro sealed away was not some eccentric collector hoarding cars for fun. He was a respected dealership manager with a spotless reputation, someone who had sold hundreds of vehicles without a single unusual incident on record. Which is exactly why what happened next confused everyone who worked with him. According to former employees who were tracked down decades later, the manager received that particular Camaro as part of a normal shipment, nothing special about the paperwork, nothing flagged, nothing unusual. But within days of it arriving, his entire attitude toward the car changed. He stopped letting salespeople near it. He personally moved it into the back building himself, late one evening when almost nobody else was on the property, and from that point forward he refused to discuss it, not with customers, not with his own family, when his son, decades later, was asked about it. He said his father would simply change the subject any time the storage building came up, as if the conversation itself made him uncomfortable. Whatever happened with that car, it happened fast, and it left a mark on a man who otherwise seemed completely unshaken by anything in his professional life. So what could possibly make an experienced dealer look at a brand new Camaro and decide the safest thing to do was hide it from the entire world? Here is where I need you to remember something, because it becomes very important later. This all happened during a period when Chevrolet itself was dealing with an internal crisis around certain high-performance components going into the Camaro line. Components that were, depending on who you ask, either slightly ahead of their time or dangerously undertested. We are going to come back to that detail. Keep it in the back of your mind, because it connects directly to what was eventually found behind that door, and it is not what most people expect. To understand how something like that could even happen without the public ever knowing, you have to remember what the automotive industry looked like at the time. There was no internet, no instant recall databases, no way for a customer 3 states away to find out what a dealership 2 towns over was quietly dealing with. Information moved through phone calls, printed memos, and word of mouth between people who trusted each other, which meant a problem could be contained, or at least significantly slowed down, as long as the right people stayed quiet. That system worked in favor of large manufacturers more often than most people realize, and it worked especially well for smaller, more limited issues that never reached the scale of an official public recall. A handful of vehicles, a handful of dealers, a quiet phone call, and the problem essentially disappears from public view without a single newspaper ever printing a word about it. This is the environment the dealership manager was operating in, and it is the environment that allowed one ordinary Camaro to simply vanish from official records without triggering a single alarm anywhere in the system. For the next 4.5 decades, that Camaro sat completely undisturbed. The dealership itself changed hands more than once. New owners walked the property, inventoried the buildings, and somehow, every single time, that particular storage unit got labeled as off-limits or simply overlooked entirely. Buried in old paperwork nobody bothered to dig through. Some longtime locals in the area actually knew the building existed, but almost nobody knew what was inside it. It became one of those quiet, small-town mysteries, the kind of thing people mention once and then forget about for years at a time, a rumor with no real weight behind it. Until a restoration specialist, someone who spends his career tracking down exactly these kinds of forgotten vehicles, started asking questions after stumbling across old dealership records during an unrelated research project. He noticed a Camaro listed on paper that had never, according to any state title record, ever been resold, never registered to a new owner, never scrapped. It simply vanished from the records after its original delivery date, like the car had ceased to exist the moment it arrived at that dealership. That kind of gap in the paperwork is exactly what serious car historians live for, because it usually means one of two things. Either the vehicle was destroyed and nobody documented it properly, or it is still out there somewhere, completely forgotten. The restoration specialist spent months tracking down former employees, cross-referencing old delivery logs, and eventually landed on a name, the son of the original dealership manager, now much older himself, living a quiet life 2 states away. When he was finally reached and asked directly about a Camaro that vanished from the books in the same year his father took over daily operations at that location, his response was not what anyone expected. He did not deny knowing about the car. He simply said his father made him promise never to open that building. And he had kept that promise for over 40 years. But promises made to a father who has since passed away carry a different weight than promises made to a father who is still alive to enforce them. After a long conversation, and after learning that the storage building itself was scheduled to be demolished as part of a property redevelopment plan, the son finally agreed. It was now or never. If nobody opened that door before the demolition crews arrived, whatever secret his father had spent 45 years protecting would be crushed and hauled away in a dumpster, gone forever, with no explanation ever given. Before we get to what happened when that door finally opened, I want you to sit with one more detail, because it is the kind of thing that changes how you see this entire story once you hear it. The neighbor who was present the day they finally opened the building was not just a random acquaintance. She had lived next to the dealership manager for over 30 years, close enough that their families shared holidays together, close enough that she genuinely believed she knew almost everything about his life. And yet, when she was asked beforehand if she had any idea what was behind that door, her answer was a flat, immediate no. 30 years of friendship. And the man had never once let it slip, never once hinted, never once given her a single reason to suspect that a locked building on his property held anything more significant than old inventory or spare parts. That is the kind of discipline we are talking about here, not a slip of the tongue after a few drinks, not a moment of weakness late at night. Total, complete silence, maintained for the rest of his natural life, in front of people he loved and trusted every single day. The day they finally opened that building, there were only a handful of people present. The restoration specialist, the son, a close family friend who had been the manager's neighbor decades earlier, and a single documentary crew who had gotten wind that something significant was happening. The door had rusted shut in places, and it took real effort just to pry it open enough to slide inside. The air that came out was stale, the kind of stale that only comes from a space that has not exchanged oxygen with the outside world in decades. Flashlights swept across the darkness, and slowly, shapes started to emerge, and there it was, sitting exactly where it had been parked 45 years earlier, still on its original tires, covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust that had settled evenly across every surface like snow. A Camaro, frozen in time, looking almost exactly like it did the day it rolled off the assembly line, except aged by decades of complete stillness rather than decades of use. For a moment, nobody said anything. The restoration specialist later described that silence as one of the most surreal moments of his entire career, standing in front of a machine that had essentially been paused in 1980 and left running in the background of history ever since. But here's the part that changes everything, the part that turns this from a simple barn find story into something far stranger. Because as the restoration specialist began carefully documenting the car, checking the vehicle identification number, cross-referencing production records, comparing everything against Chevrolet's original build sheets, something did not add up. The numbers on this particular Camaro did not match a standard production run. They matched something closer to a very small batch of vehicles that were quietly pulled from certain dealerships during that same era. Vehicles connected to that internal Chevrolet crisis we mentioned earlier. The one involving high-performance components that engineers were still not fully confident in. In other words, this was not just any Camaro sitting behind that locked door. Evidence strongly suggests it was one of an extremely limited number of vehicles that Chevrolet, through informal channels, rather than any official public recall, asked select dealers to quietly pull from customer availability, while internal engineers continued evaluating a potential issue. No public announcement, no paper trail that survived in any meaningful way. Just a handful of phone calls, a handful of trusted dealers, and a handful of cars that were expected to simply disappear from inventory without drawing attention. Most of those vehicles, according to research the specialists compiled from surviving parts suppliers and retired engineers who were willing to speak decades later, were eventually quietly modified, resold, or in some documented cases, destroyed entirely, all without public knowledge. This dealership manager appears to have taken a different, far more permanent approach. Instead of sending the car back through official channels, or risking that a modified version might one day be linked back to him if something ever did go wrong, he simply made the car disappear on his own terms. He locked it away where nobody, not customers, not investigators, not even his own family, would ever be able to connect it to anything. If that theory is correct, and multiple independent researchers who reviewed the restoration specialist's findings believe it likely is, then that dealership manager was not hiding a car out of eccentricity or superstition. He was protecting himself, his dealership, and possibly people close to him from being tied to a quiet, undocumented safety concern that Chevrolet never wanted publicly acknowledged in the first place. He kept that secret until the day he died. He never told his customers. He never told his employees. He barely told his own son the full truth, only enough to make sure the building stayed locked. Decades of silence, all to protect something that most people would assume was nothing more than a dusty old car sitting in storage. Now I know some of you are thinking this sounds almost too dramatic to be true, and that is a completely fair reaction to have. Stories like this tend to grow bigger and stranger with every person who repeats them, and it would be irresponsible to pretend every detail here has been verified with absolute, ironclad certainty. Some of what we know comes from surviving paperwork and confirmed vehicle records. Some of it comes from second-hand accounts, family memories, and educated reconstruction built by people who have spent their entire careers piecing together exactly these kinds of automotive mysteries. What remains undeniable, though, is the car itself. It exists. It sat behind that door for 45 years. Its identification numbers do trace back to that unusual limited production window. And the man who locked it away did, by every account from people who actually knew him, treat that building with a level of secrecy that went far beyond simply forgetting about an old car in storage. So what happens to a car like this once it finally sees daylight again after 45 years of complete isolation? You might expect the tires to be flat, the engine to be seized solid, the interior to be destroyed by decades of trapped humidity. And in a lot of barn find stories, that is exactly what you get, a rusted-out shell that needs to be completely rebuilt from the frame up. But this Camaro was different, because unlike most barn finds that sit exposed to shifting temperatures, moisture, and pests over the years, this one had been sealed in a genuinely airtight structure, on a raised concrete floor, away from ground moisture, with almost no temperature swing thanks to the building's construction. When the restoration team finally checked under the hood, the engine, while obviously not ready to run without proper preparation, showed remarkably little internal corrosion. The interior, protected from sunlight for its entire existence, still had color and texture that looked closer to a car with a few thousand miles than one that had technically existed for nearly 5 decades. It was in almost every meaningful sense a time capsule, not a ruin waiting to be rebuilt, but a genuine snapshot of 1980, preserved almost perfectly by pure accident, or perhaps by very deliberate, very careful planning from a man who wanted to make absolutely sure that whatever secret he was protecting stayed protected for as long as possible. word of the discovery did not stay quiet for long. Within a week of the building being opened, photos from the documentary crew started circulating in classic car forums, and almost immediately, the theories began piling up faster than anyone could verify them. Some people were convinced the car had to be connected to a factory test program that was never meant to reach dealer inventory at all, mistakenly shipped due to a paperwork error, and quietly buried once someone realized the mistake. Others were certain it had nothing to do with any safety concern whatsoever, and that the real explanation was something far more personal, a private bet, a family dispute, an insurance situation nobody wanted to touch. For a while, it genuinely felt like everyone had a different theory, and every single one of them sounded just plausible enough to be true. The restoration specialist, to his credit, refused to simply accept the most dramatic version of events without evidence. He kept digging, kept calling old suppliers, kept requesting whatever surviving internal documents he could track down through people willing to talk after all these decades. And slowly, piece by piece, the safety-related explanation kept coming back as the version that actually matched the physical evidence on the car itself, not just the more exciting rumor floating around online. And that brings us to the question that has been sitting underneath this entire story from the very beginning. What is this car actually worth now? Not just in dollars, although the number being discussed by serious collectors is already substantial given the rarity, the history, and the almost untouched condition. What is it worth as a piece of history? As a physical object that connects directly to a moment when one of the biggest car companies in the world quietly handled a problem behind closed doors. And one ordinary dealership manager decided the safest thing he could do was make that problem vanish completely, at whatever personal cost that decision carried for the rest of his life. He never profited from it. He never told the story to anyone who could have made him famous for it. He simply carried the weight of that secret in silence, year after year, decade after decade, right up until the day he passed away, trusting his own son to keep the door locked even after he was gone. There is something almost haunting about that kind of loyalty to a secret, especially when you consider how easily he could have taken the simpler path. He could have quietly sold the car through unofficial channels and made real money from it decades ago. He could have modified it just enough to erase any trace of its unusual origin and passed it off as an ordinary vehicle. Instead, he chose the hardest option available to him. He chose to remove it from the world entirely, and to live the rest of his life never speaking about it, never explaining himself, never once breaking that silence, even to the people closest to him. Whatever he was protecting, whether it was his own reputation, his dealership's future, people he cared about, or some combination of all three, he clearly believed it was worth an enormous, ongoing personal sacrifice to keep buried. Right now, that Camaro sits in a climate-controlled facility while a small team carefully documents every original component before any restoration work even begins. Because in cases like this, the untouched original condition is often more valuable historically than a fully restored version would ever be. Researchers are still working to track down additional records from that era, hoping to more precisely confirm exactly how many vehicles were part of that same quiet, undocumented process, and what ultimately happened to the rest of them. Some may still be sitting in garages or storage units somewhere, completely unknown to their current owners, who have no idea what they are actually looking at every time they walk past them, which raises an unsettling thought to leave you with. If a car this significant could sit forgotten, sealed away, and completely unknown for 45 years, right in the middle of an ordinary small town, hidden in plain sight the entire time, how many other stories like this one are still out there right now? How many garages, barns, and forgotten storage buildings are quietly holding on to secrets nobody has uncovered yet, waiting for someone curious enough to start asking the right questions the way this restoration specialist did? Because that is exactly how this story started. Not with some grand investigation, just one person noticing a small gap in old paperwork, refusing to let it go, and following it all the way to the truth. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled me in when I first came across it, you're going to want to see what else is sitting quietly forgotten in garages across this country, because this is far from the strangest discovery hiding in plain sight. Subscribe, because the next hidden car story might just be the one that changes how you see every old garage you pass by from now on. Somewhere out there right now there's another building just like that one, sitting quietly at the edge of a property nobody thinks twice about, holding onto a secret that has not been touched in decades. Maybe it is a car, maybe it is something else entirely, But the only way any of these stories ever come to light is because someone refused to accept a small, unexplained gap in the records and decided to keep pulling on that thread until the truth finally came loose. That is what this channel is built around, finding those threads before they disappear forever, and following them all the way to the end. So if stories like this genuinely fascinate you, make sure you are subscribed, because we are already tracking down the next one, and it might be even stranger than this.